you spent over $400 million to get Americans to know you. And you came out on stage and blew it almost as soon as you showed up.
You put the piece of metal on the lathe, you turn the crank in the direction of the arrow, and you can have a job. And we created a lot of jobs.
What?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
If you ever thought President Donald J. Trump's popularity, success, or occupancy in the White House was attributable to his billions, take a look at the presidential wannabe, Michael Bloomberg, and think again. Now, on the surface, Trump and Bloomberg might appear similar. Both New York City strong-willed billionaires, each running to be president in 2020. But the similarities end there. The obituaries written after Bloomberg's disastrous, horrifying, and embarrassing performance at the Nevada Democrat debate tell the story. Now, most people outside of New York City don't know who Michael Bloomberg is. And after watching the debate, I'm not sure even he knows who he is. Once a Democrat, then a Republican, then an independent, and now a Democrat in order to run for president. The man is so wishy-washy and spineless that he doesn't just flip-flop, he flip-flops and then backflips without any logical, rational explanation other than political expediency. As a result, he has single-handedly managed to alienate just about everyone he needs in his quixotic effort to become president. Consider the following. Now, there are at least 40 separate work discrimination and sexual harassment cases that he has settled at his company, all of them sealed by a non-disclosure agreement preventing the women from speaking. To her credit, Elizabeth Warren, like a high school principal dressing down a juvenile, went up one side of Bloomberg and down the other. Take a look.
Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements so we can hear their side of the story?
None of them accused me of doing anything other than maybe they didn't like the joke I told. And let me put, there's agreements between two parties that wanted to keep it quiet, and that's up to them. They signed those agreements, and we'll live with it.
Well, apparently his handlers decided he couldn't live with it and that his muzzling and then refusing to release the women from these agreements would not stand. So, according to the Washington Post, though, Bloomberg has for years battled women's allegations of profane, sexist comments as he ran a company where the culture of sexual harassment and degradation of women appeared to be pervasive. The most high-profile case from a former saleswoman who sued Bloomberg, alleging he told her to, quote, kill it when he learned she was pregnant. The Post interviewed a former employee who witnessed that very conversation. Now, that kind of behavior has managed to tee off a lot of women in America. And then there's stop and frisk. Bloomberg has since apologized for using stop and frisk at the time he was mayor, managing to alienate just about all of law enforcement and those who believe that, if handled correctly, stop and frisk was an effective crime-fighting tool. But he was so unprepared for this question that is of particular interest to the African-American community and that he must court in his bid to be president that he stumbled and acted as though he never even expected the question.
Well, if I go back and look at my time in office, the one thing that I'm really worried about, embarrassed about, was how it turned out with stop and frisk.
And by the way, in that landmark decision, Terry versus Ohio, the United States Supreme Court, with Justice Thurgood Marshall joining the majority, ruled that the Fourth Amendment prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures is not violated under stop and frisk if the officer has a reasonable suspicion that the person is involved in criminality and that he may be armed. But you know, Mayor, what you should be even more worried about is the fact that you believe that the way to get guns out of kids' hands is to throw them up against the wall and frisk them, and that 95% of murders fit one MO. You think you can just take a description, Xerox it, and pass it out to all the cops. And then you say that you're trying to understand race issues by talking to, quote, a bunch of African-American clergy and business people? You sat down with a bunch of African-American clergy to figure this out? But the shame of this is the one signature accomplishment that you continued from the Rudy Giuliani administration, where lives were actually saved. Now, because of political expediency, you disavow yourself of this and say if you had to do it over again, you would not do stop and frisk. Essentially saying you'd go back to the pre-Giuliani homicide rate of 2,500 New York City victims a year. And then there are the farmers and the factory workers. Take a look at this.
We just more and more, if you think about it, the agrarian society lasted 3,000 years, and we could teach processes. I could teach anybody, even people in this room, so no offense intended, to be a farmer. It's a process. You dig a hole, you put a seed in, you put dirt on top, add water, up comes the corn. Then we had 300, you could learn that. Then you have 300 years of the industrial society. You put the piece of metal on the lathe, you turn the crank and the direction of the arrow, and you can have a job. And we created a lot of jobs.
What?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
I agree. Need I remind you, Mr. Mayor, you're running as a Democrat in the most liberal, progressive, leftist bunch of presidential candidates in American history, and you cannot exhibit or articulate blatant transphobia. Quote, if your conversation during a presidential election is about some guy wearing a dress and whether he, she, or it can go to the locker room with their daughter, that's not a winning formula for most people. Close quote. Okay, smarty pants. So far, you managed to tee off the women, the African Americans, farmers, factory workers, law enforcement, the LGBTQ community. Now, is there anyone left? Oh, yes. If you're 95 and you need medical care, we probably shouldn't have to give it to you since, according to Bloomberg, it's not really cost effective.
You show up with prostate cancer and you're 95 years old. We should say, go and enjoy, have a nice meal, live a long life. There's no cure. And you can't do anything. If you're a young person, we should do something about it.
Get it? And how about family members of the victims of one of the greatest hate crimes in our nation's history? You tried to make it look like you were mayor of the city of New York on 9/11, and by the way, you weren't. Rudy Giuliani was. But you made sure, although the city charter allows for just 2 terms, you bought your way into a 3rd term. I suspect you might even try to do the same were you to be elected president, which, by the way, will never happen. And by the way, speaking of 9/11, you're on tape telling the widows of the victims killed that day to, quote, suck it up and move on. And finally, then there's another kind of small category, guns. That pretty much alienates everyone else in the country. I have guns, handguns, long guns, as do many, many Americans. We're law-abiding citizens, and we're not responsible for what some criminal does with his or her gun. But you, Mr. Bloomberg, want to do everything in your power to take away those guns. I got news for you. It ain't going to happen. And I understand you're plotting a strategy for a brokered convention. Smart, seeing as you haven't won a single delegate, you can't answer a single question, you've got huge negatives, you're an elitist, you were the biggest loser at the highest watched debate in Democrat history. And might I add, You spent over $400 million to get Americans to know you, and you came out on stage and blew it almost as soon as you showed up. Might I suggest a new debate team or a personality change? You certainly can afford it. And that's my open.